Imagine for a moment that everything you thought you knew about the dawn of civilization was wrong. That the timeline you learned in school, first came hunter-gatherers, then farming, then religion, then temples, was actually backwards. That somewhere in southeastern Turkey, buried under a hillside for over 11,000 years, lay evidence that would force us to completely reimagine how human civilization began. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was wandering through the Turkish countryside near the city of Şanlıurfa. He was following up on a brief survey from the 1960s that had dismissed a particular hill as nothing more than a medieval cemetery. But Schmidt saw something others had missed: flints scattered across the ground that were far older than medieval times, and a shape to the hill that seemed too perfect to be natural. What he found when he began to dig would shake the foundations of archaeology: massive T-shaped pillars, some standing 18 feet tall and weighing up to 50 tons, arranged in perfect circles, intricate carvings of animals, lions, foxes, scorpions, vultures, dancing across the stone, complex architectural structures that would have required hundreds of people to build. And it was old, older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, older than the pyramids by 7,000 years, built before humans had even invented pottery, before they had domesticated wheat, before they had settled into villages. Göbekli Tepe, which means pot-belly hill in Turkish, wasn't supposed to exist. According to everything archaeologists thought they knew, hunter-gatherers living 11,600 years ago shouldn't have been able to build something like this. They shouldn't have had the social organization, the resources, or the motivation. Yet here it stood, or rather lay buried, waiting to tell us that the story of humanity's awakening was far stranger and more mysterious than we had ever imagined. Tonight, we're going to journey back to the end of the last ice age, to a time when the world was transforming, when humans were becoming something new, and when, for reasons we still don't fully understand, groups of hunter-gatherers came together to build the world's first temple. We'll explore what Göbekli Tepe tells us about our ancestors, about the birth of religion, and about the mysterious force that drove humans to move mountains, literally, in service of something beyond survival. To understand the revolution that Göbekli Tepe represents, we need to first understand the world in which it was built. 11,600 years ago, the Earth was emerging from the Younger Dryas, the last gasp of the Ice Age. For over 1,000 years, temperatures had plummeted, glaciers had advanced, and the relatively warm, wet conditions that humans had been enjoying suddenly reversed. The landscape around what is now southeastern Turkey would have been dramatically different from today's arid hills. This was the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from modern-day Iraq through Syria and Turkey to Israel and Jordan. But fertile is a relative term. This wasn't a lush paradise. It was a wild landscape of grasslands and scattered woodlands, home to vast herds of gazelles, wild cattle called aurochs, and predators like lions and leopards that have long since vanished from the region. The humans living here were hunter-gatherers, moving in small bands of perhaps 25 maybe 50 people, following the seasonal migrations of animals and the ripening of wild plants. They had no permanent homes, no domesticated animals, except perhaps dogs, no crops. Their tools were made of stone, bone, and wood. They had no metal, no wheel, no writing. By every measure we traditionally use to define civilization, they had none of it. Yet these people, these supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers, conceived and built something extraordinary. Göbekli Tepe consists of at least 20 circular enclosures, though only a fraction have been excavated. Each circle is made of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, arranged like a crowd of giants frozen in stone. The pillars are decorated with elaborate reliefs, not crude stick figures but sophisticated art depicting dozens of animal species with remarkable anatomical accuracy. The T-shape of the pillars seems to be intentionally anthropomorphic. They appear to represent stylized humans or perhaps gods, with the horizontal top representing a head and the vertical shaft a body. Some pillars have arms and hands carved in relief along their sides, and belts and loincloths are depicted on others. These aren't just pillars. They're beings, watchers, participants in some lost ritual we can barely imagine. But here's what makes Göbekli Tepe truly revolutionary. There's no evidence that anyone lived there. No houses, no cooking hearths, no trash middens full of daily refuse. There are no water sources nearby. This wasn't a settlement. It was a destination. People came here for a specific purpose, probably gathering from many miles around, and that purpose seems to have been purely spiritual or ceremonial. The construction itself would have been a monumental undertaking. The limestone pillars were quarried from the surrounding plateau, with the largest ones carved directly from the bedrock. Without metal tools, workers would have used stone picks and perhaps wooden wedges to split the rock. Without wheels or draft animals, they would have moved these massive stones using wooden rollers, ropes made from plant fibers, and human muscle power alone. Conservative estimates suggest that carving, moving, and erecting a single pillar would have required 500 people working for several months. The entire complex, built over centuries, represents millions of hours of human labor. And remember, these were hunter-gatherers, people who needed to spend most of their time finding food. The organization required to feed workers, coordinate labor, and maintain the social cohesion necessary for such a project challenges everything we thought we knew about pre-agricultural societies. But why? Why would hunter-gatherers, living on the edge of survival, devote such enormous resources to building what appears to be a temple? This question has haunted archaeologists since Göbekli Tepe's discovery. The possible answers are reshaping our understanding of why humans first began to settle down and farm. The traditional narrative, taught in schools for decades, goes like this. Humans discovered agriculture, which created food surpluses, which allowed some people to specialize in activities other than food production, which led to complex societies which eventually built temples and monuments. It's a logical progression. First came the practical matter of feeding people, then came the luxury of religion and monument building. Göbekli Tepe turns this narrative on its head. Here we have monuments before farming, temples before towns, religion before agriculture. Klaus Schmidt, who excavated the site until his death in 2014, proposed a radical idea. Maybe it was the other way around. Maybe the need to build and maintain temples like Göbekli Tepe drove humans to develop agriculture. Think about it. Gathering hundreds of people to build these monuments would have required feeding them. Wild resources in any given area would quickly be exhausted by such large groups. Perhaps the builders began deliberately planting wild grains near the site to ensure food supplies. Perhaps they began keeping wild animals in pens to have meat readily available. In other words, perhaps agriculture wasn't a discovery that enabled civilization. Perhaps it was an invention necessitated by the demands of religious practice. Main story block. 5,500 words. The evidence for this radical reinterpretation is compelling. Genetic studies have shown that modern domesticated wheat originated from wild varieties that grew within 20 miles of Göbekli Tepe. The region around the site is one of the few places on Earth where the wild ancestors of wheat, barley, and other founder crops all grew naturally. It's as if Göbekli Tepe sits at the epicenter of the agricultural revolution. But the site tells us about more than just the origins of farming. It offers a window into the minds of our ancestors at a crucial turning point in human consciousness. The carved animals on the pillars aren't random decorations. They seem to tell stories, perhaps myths or astronomical observations. Scorpions, snakes, and vultures appear frequently, animals often associated with death and transformation in later cultures. There are no depictions of hunting scenes or daily life. These images speak to something beyond the mundane, something spiritual or cosmological. One pillar, known as Pillar 43 or the Vulture Stone, has attracted particular attention. It shows a vulture with a sphere above its wing, a headless human figure, and various other animals. Some researchers have proposed that this scene depicts a catastrophic event, perhaps a comet impact that occurred around 10,950 BCE, coinciding with the beginning of the Younger Dryas Cold period. The arrangement of animals might represent constellations, making this possibly the world's oldest astronomical observation. The layered nature of Göbekli Tepe adds another dimension to the mystery. The site wasn't built all at once. It was constructed, used, and then deliberately buried and rebuilt multiple times over more than 1,500 years. Each layer shows increasingly sophisticated construction techniques, but paradoxically, smaller and less impressive pillars. It's as if the greatest effort was expended at the beginning, with later generations unable or unwilling to match their ancestors' achievements. Even more intriguingly, the entire complex was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE. This wasn't destruction or abandonment. It was careful, deliberate burial. The enclosures were filled with debris, stones, and soil. Someone, or some group, decided that Göbekli Tepe's time was over and took great care to preserve it by hiding it. Why? Were they protecting it, ending its power, preparing it for rediscovery by future generations? We may never know. The social implications of Göbekli Tepe are staggering. Hunter-gatherer societies are typically egalitarian, with no formal leaders or hierarchies. But organizing the construction of Göbekli Tepe would have required some form of leadership, some way of motivating and coordinating large groups of people. Were there shamans or priests who directed the work? Were there chiefs who commanded labor? Or was this a communal effort driven by shared religious vision? The site also suggests that hunter-gatherers had much more complex societies than we previously imagined. They must have had sophisticated systems of communication to coordinate gatherings. They must have had shared mythologies and belief systems that motivated them to undertake such massive projects. They must have had ways of resolving conflicts and maintaining cooperation among diverse groups. Recent excavations have revealed even more surprises. Ground-penetrating radar has shown that only about 5% of the site has been excavated. There are at least 16 more enclosures waiting to be uncovered, and possibly many more. The site is much larger than initially thought, perhaps covering up to 22 acres. Each new discovery adds layers to the mystery, rather than solving it. Evidence of feasting has been found at the site, massive quantities of animal bones, particularly from wild cattle and gazelles. These weren't everyday meals, but spectacular gatherings where hundreds of people came together to share food and presumably participate in rituals. Beer production might have occurred here too. Large stone vessels that could have been used for brewing have been found. Was Göbekli Tepe the site of humanity's first religious festivals, complete with feasting and alcohol? The artwork becomes more intriguing the more closely it's examined. The carvings show a deep understanding of animal anatomy and behavior. The sculptors knew how these animals moved, how they stood, their characteristic poses. This suggests prolonged observation, perhaps even a spiritual connection with the animal world that we've lost in our modern separation from nature. Some of the most enigmatic carvings are of creatures that might be mythological or might represent animals now extinct in the region. There are depictions of what might be dinosaurs or dragons, likely based on fossil finds that ancient people interpreted through their own worldview. There are humanoid figures with strange proportions that might represent gods, spirits, or shamans in ritual costume. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe has triggered a complete reevaluation of other ancient sites. Structures previously dated to much later periods are being re-examined. Sites dismissed as natural formations are being reconsidered. The possibility that sophisticated monument building began much earlier than thought has opened new avenues of research. Nearby sites like Karahan Tepe and Sefer Tepe show similar T-shaped pillars, may be contemporary with or even older than Göbekli Tepe. This suggests that monument building wasn't an isolated phenomenon but part of a broader cultural tradition across the region. We might be looking at a previously unknown civilization, not in the sense of cities and writing, but in the sense of shared culture, religion, and architectural tradition spanning hundreds of miles and thousands of years. Göbekli Tepe forces us to reconsider the role of religion in human development. For decades, anthropologists have debated when and how religion emerged. Some argued it was a luxury that only appeared after humans had secured their basic needs. Others suggested it was adaptive, helping groups cooperate and survive. Göbekli Tepe suggests something more profound. Religion might have been the driving force behind the entire Neolithic revolution. Consider what religion provides that pure survival doesn't, meaning purpose, identity, and a reason to transcend individual needs for something greater. At Göbekli Tepe, we see humans pouring enormous resources into something that provided no immediate survival benefit. No one could eat stone pillars. They couldn't hunt with them or use them for shelter, yet they built them anyway. Generation after generation. This suggests that the need for meaning, for connection to something beyond the material world, is as fundamental to human nature as the need for food or shelter. Perhaps it's even more fundamental. After all, humans at Göbekli Tepe chose to build temples before they chose to build permanent homes. The symbols carved on the pillars might represent humanity's first attempts at creating a permanent record of beliefs and stories. Without writing, these images were the only way to transmit complex ideas across generations. Each animal might have represented a clan, a constellation, a deity, or a mythological event. The pillars themselves, with their anthropomorphic shape, might represent ancestors or gods watching over the gatherings. The vulture imagery is particularly significant. Vultures appear on multiple pillars, often in prominent positions. In many ancient cultures, vultures were associated with death and rebirth. With the transition between worlds, they were psychopomps, guides who carried souls from one realm to another. The prominence of vultures at Göbekli Tepe might indicate that the site was connected to death rituals or beliefs about the afterlife. But vultures also played a practical role in ancient burial practices. Sky burial, exposing corpses to be consumed by vultures, was practiced by many cultures, and might have been practiced here. The vultures carved on the pillars might not just be symbolic, but might represent actual birds that performed sacred functions at the site. Recent analysis of the carvings at Göbekli Tepe has revealed possible astronomical alignments and observations that push back the history of astronomy by thousands of years. The arrangement of animals on Pillar 43, the vulture stone, corresponds remarkably well with constellations as they would have appeared in 10,950 BCE. If this interpretation is correct, it suggests our ancestors were carefully observing the night sky and recording their observations in stone 7,000 years before the first known astronomical texts. They were noting the precession of the equinoxes, tracking the movement of constellations over centuries or even millennia. The circular enclosures themselves might have astronomical significance. Some researchers have proposed that they're aligned with specific stars or with sunrise on significant dates. The pillars might have served as markers for tracking celestial movements, making Göbekli Tepe not just a temple but an observatory. This astronomical knowledge wouldn't have been mere curiosity. For hunter-gatherers, understanding seasonal patterns was crucial for survival. Knowing when animals would migrate, when plants would ripen, when rains would come, all of this depended on reading natural cycles, including celestial ones. The sky was their calendar, and Göbekli Tepe might have been where they formalized and transmitted this knowledge. The potential comet impact depicted on Pillar 43 is particularly intriguing. If the interpretation is correct, it would mean that the builders of Göbekli Tepe witnessed and recorded a catastrophic event that might have triggered the Younger Dryas Cold period. This would make the pillar not just art, but a historical record, a warning to future generations about the dangers from the sky. The timing of Göbekli Tepe's construction is particularly intriguing because it coincides with one of the most dramatic climate changes in human history, the Younger Dryas, lasting from about 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, saw a sudden return to Ice Age conditions after a period of warming. Temperatures dropped by as much as 15 degrees Celsius in some regions, forests retreated, grasslands expanded, and human populations faced severe stress. Göbekli Tepe was built just as this cold period was ending, and the world was warming again. This warming marking the beginning of the Holocene epoch, created conditions favorable for agriculture, but it also disrupted established patterns of plant and animal life that hunter-gatherers had relied on for millennia. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was a response to this climate chaos, a place where scattered bands could gather to share information about changing conditions, to maintain social bonds during difficult times, or to appeal to supernatural forces for stability. The stress of rapid environmental change might have sparked the religious and social innovations we see at the site. The deliberately buried layers at Göbekli Tepe might correspond to different climate phases, with each rebuilding representing an adaptation to new conditions. The decreasing size of pillars over time might reflect declining resources as the climate changed and old ways of life became impossible. The site might also have served as a kind of information exchange, where hunter-gatherer groups shared knowledge about changing animal migration patterns, new plant distributions, and successful adaptation strategies. In this view, Göbekli Tepe wasn't just a temple but a university, a place where crucial survival knowledge was preserved and transmitted. The construction of Göbekli Tepe required a level of social organization previously thought impossible for hunter-gatherers. Someone had to plan the structures, organize work parties, feed the workers, and maintain order among diverse groups. This suggests the existence of what anthropologists call trans-egalitarian societies, groups that were moving beyond simple egalitarianism toward hierarchy and specialization. Evidence from the site suggests that different groups might have been responsible for different enclosures. Each circle has slightly different artistic styles and construction techniques, possibly representing different clans or tribes. Yet they all followed a common template, suggesting overarching cultural unity. The feasting remains found at the site indicate large gatherings where social bonds were reinforced through shared meals. These weren't just construction projects. They were social events that brought together people who might normally be competitors for resources. The shared work and ritual might have helped create larger group identities beyond the immediate band or family. This social complexity might have been self-reinforcing. As groups grew larger through religious gatherings, they would have depleted local resources more quickly, necessitating either migration or intensification of resource use. Intensification, deliberately increasing the productivity of the land, is one path to agriculture. The gender dynamics of Göbekli Tepe remain mysterious. The site's imagery is predominantly masculine. No clear depictions of women or feminine symbols have been found. This might suggest that the site was used primarily by men, perhaps for initiation rituals or male bonding ceremonies. Or it might reflect the biases of a male-dominated society. The absence of female imagery is itself a clue to the social organization of the builders. While Göbekli Tepe's builders lacked metal tools, they displayed remarkable technological sophistication. The precision of the carvings, some only millimeters deep yet perfectly proportioned, suggests advanced techniques we don't fully understand. Tool marks on the pillars show that the carvers used stone picks, but achieving such fine detail with these crude instruments would have required extraordinary skill and patience. Some researchers have suggested they might have used acid from plants to soften the limestone, though no direct evidence for this has been found. The logistics of construction reveal impressive engineering knowledge. The builders understood leverage, load distribution, and structural stability. They knew how to quarry stone without fracturing it, how to move massive weights without wheels, and how to erect pillars without modern lifting equipment. Recent experiments attempting to replicate their techniques have shown just how difficult this would have been. Moving a 10-ton pillar using only wooden rollers, ropes, and human power requires perfect coordination among hundreds of workers. A single mistake could be catastrophic, yet there's no evidence of failed attempts or collapsed structures at Göbekli Tepe. The precision of the circular enclosures is remarkable. Despite lacking surveying instruments, the builders created near-perfect circles with pillars evenly spaced. They must have had some system of measurement and planning, perhaps using ropes and stakes in ways we haven't fully reconstructed. Despite decades of excavation and analysis, the true purpose of Göbekli Tepe remains elusive. Was it purely religious? Was it an astronomical observatory, a gathering place for trade, A neutral ground for conflict resolution? The answer might be all of the above. The lack of domestic structures suggests people didn't live here permanently, but the scale of construction indicates they stayed for extended periods. Perhaps it operated seasonally, with gatherings timed to coincide with animal migrations or plant harvests. Perhaps different groups used it at different times for different purposes. The animal carvings might represent a catalog of the natural world, an attempt to capture and control nature through art, or they might tell stories, myths about the creation of the world, the adventures of culture heroes, or the origins of death. Without written records, we can only guess at the narratives these images embodied. The deliberate burial of the site adds another layer of mystery. Why, after centuries of use, did the builders decide to carefully bury their creation? Was it to preserve it for future generations? To end its power? To prevent enemies from using it? The care taken in burial suggests respect rather than destruction, but the motivation remains unknown. Some researchers have suggested that the burial might have been connected to the success of agriculture. As farming communities developed and people settled into villages, the old gathering place of hunter-gatherers might have become obsolete or even threatening to the new order. Burying it might have been a way of honoring the past while moving forward into a new era. One compelling interpretation of Göbekli Tepe is that it was a center for shamanic practices. The animal imagery, the possible astronomical alignments, and the monumental architecture all fit patterns seen in shamanic cultures worldwide. Shamanism, broadly defined, involves specialists who enter altered states of consciousness to interact with the spirit world. The animals carved on the pillars might represent spirit guides or totems. The circular enclosures might have been spaces for ritual dances or ceremonies designed to induce trance states. Some of the imagery suggests hallucinogenic experiences. The geometric patterns, the hybrid creatures, the emphasis on predatory animals, all are common themes in art inspired by psychedelic experiences. The region around Göbekli Tepe has several plants with psychoactive properties that might have been used in rituals. The T-shaped pillars themselves might represent shamans or shamanic spirits. Their anthropomorphic form but abstract features suggest beings that are human-like but not quite human, exactly how shamanic spirits are often described. The belts and loincloths carved on some pillars might represent ritual garments worn by shamans. If Göbekli Tepe was a shamanic center, it might have served as a place where shamans from different groups gathered to share knowledge, undergo initiations, or perform rituals for the broader community. This would explain both the monumental architecture and the lack of everyday habitation. While Göbekli Tepe is unique in its age and scale, it's not entirely without parallels. Around the world, evidence is emerging of monument building by hunter-gatherers that challenges our assumptions about social complexity. In Russia, the site of Sungir, dating to 30,000 years ago, contains elaborate burials with thousands of mammoth ivory beads that would have taken thousands of hours to produce. In Japan, the Jomon culture was creating pottery and living in semi-permanent settlements while still hunting and gathering. In Louisiana, the earthworks at Poverty Point were built by hunter-gatherers around 1700 BCE. These sites suggest that the impulse to create monuments, to invest labor in structures beyond immediate practical need, is deeply rooted in human nature. Göbekli Tepe might be the earliest and most impressive example, but it's part of a broader pattern of human behavior that transcends particular cultures or environments. The contemporaneous site of Jericho, just a few hundred miles south of Göbekli Tepe, shows a different path to social complexity. There, people were building defensive walls and towers while still in the early stages of agriculture. The contrast between religious Göbekli Tepe and fortified Jericho might represent two different responses to the challenges of the Neolithic transition. Göbekli Tepe might mark a crucial transition in human consciousness, the moment when humans began to see themselves as separate from nature, capable of reshaping their environment rather than simply adapting to it. The act of quarrying, carving, and erecting massive stones is fundamentally different from any previous human behavior we know of. This represents what some psychologists call cognitive fluidity. the ability to combine different types of thinking that were previously separate. At Göbekli Tepe, we see technical intelligence, how to build, social intelligence, how to organize groups, and spiritual intelligence, why to build, coming together in unprecedented ways. The creation of monumental architecture might have changed how humans thought about time. Building something meant to last generations requires thinking beyond immediate needs, beyond even one's own lifetime. It requires imagining a future where descendants will use and understand what you've created. This extended temporal thinking might have been crucial for the development of agriculture. Farming requires delayed gratification, planting seeds now for harvest months later. The mental habits developed through monument building might have prepared humans for the patience and planning agriculture demands. The symbolic thinking evident in the carvings represents another cognitive leap. Using animals to represent concepts, clans, or deities requires abstract thought of a high order. It's the same kind of thinking that would eventually lead to writing, mathematics, and science. Recent genetic studies have added another dimension to the Göbekli Tepe story. Analysis of ancient DNA from the region shows that the populations who built the monument were genetically distinct from both earlier hunter-gatherers and later farmers. This suggests that Göbekli Tepe might have been built by a specific population that developed unique cultural innovations. These people weren't the direct ancestors of the farmers who would later inhabit the region. They were a distinct group whose culture flourished and then vanished or was absorbed. The genetic diversity found in remains from the period suggests that Göbekli Tepe attracted people from across a wide region. This genetic mixing might have facilitated the exchange of ideas and technologies that led to the Neolithic Revolution. Studies of plant and animal DNA also support the idea that domestication began in this region around this time. The wild ancestors of wheat, barley, sheep, goats, and pigs all lived within a few hundred miles of Göbekli Tepe. The gathering of diverse peoples at the site might have accelerated the exchange of knowledge about managing these species. The genetic evidence also reveals population bottlenecks and expansions that correlate with climate events and the construction phases at Göbekli Tepe. It's as if we can see in the DNA the same story the stones are telling, of gathering and dispersal, innovation and tradition, continuity and change. Did the builders of Göbekli Tepe have language as we understand it? This question is crucial, because the level of coordination required for the site's construction seems impossible without sophisticated communication. All modern humans have the capacity for complex language, and genetic evidence suggests this capacity evolved long before Göbekli Tepe. But having the capacity and using it to its full potential are different things. The complexity of Göbekli Tepe might represent not just architectural innovation but linguistic innovation, the development of specialized vocabulary for construction, measurement, and organization. The symbolic nature of the carving suggests that the builders could communicate abstract concepts. Each animal, each geometric pattern might have had a name, a story, a meaning that could be conveyed through words. The site might have been where specialized religious or technical language developed, spreading from here throughout the region. The possibility of proto-writing at Göbekli Tepe has been suggested by some researchers. Certain geometric symbols appear repeatedly and might represent an early form of notation. While not writing in the true sense, these symbols might have conveyed meaning in ways that preceded the development of cuneiform by thousands of years. Today, Göbekli Tepe faces new challenges. Since its designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2018, tourism has increased dramatically. The site that lay hidden for 11,000 years is now exposed to weather, pollution, and the wear of thousands of visitors. Conservation efforts must balance preservation with research and public access. Protective shelters have been built over the main excavations, but these change the microclimate and might accelerate deterioration. The unexcavated portions of the site are both a reserve for future research and a conservation challenge. How do you protect something you can't fully see? Climate change poses another threat. Increasing temperatures and changing rainfall patterns in southeastern Turkey could affect the stability of the exposed structures. The limestone pillars, having been buried for millennia, are now experiencing weathering they were never subjected to before. Political instability in the region adds another layer of complexity. Göbekli Tepe sits near the Syrian border, in an area that has seen conflict and refugee movements. Protecting humanity's oldest monument requires not just archaeological expertise but diplomatic skill and international cooperation. The local community has both benefited from and been disrupted by the discovery. Tourism brings economic opportunities but also challenges to traditional ways of life. Balancing the needs of the local population with the preservation of the site requires ongoing negotiation and compromise. The philosophical implications. Göbekli Tepe challenges some of our most fundamental assumptions about human nature and progress. We tend to see history as a steady march from simple to complex, from primitive to advanced. But Göbekli Tepe suggests that complexity can emerge suddenly, that sophistication isn't always built on precedent. The site also challenges our materialist assumptions about human motivation. These people chose to build monuments before houses, to create art before pottery, to gather for ritual before settling for farming. They prioritized meaning over comfort, spirituality over security. This has implications for how we understand ourselves. If the need for transcendence, for connection to something beyond material survival, is so fundamental that it drove the creation of civilization itself, what does that say about modern life, where such needs are often dismissed as luxury or superstition? Göbekli Tepe also raises questions about knowledge and progress. The builders of the site knew things we don't. How to organize large groups without formal government, how to transmit complex information without writing, how to motivate enormous labor without coercion, as far as we can tell. In our rush toward technological progress, what wisdom have we lost? The site challenges our understanding of time and permanence. The builders created something meant to last forever, yet they also deliberately buried it. They invested enormous effort in permanence, then chose impermanence. This paradox might reflect a sophisticated understanding of cycles, of the need for both creation and destruction. The artistry of Göbekli Tepe deserves special attention. These weren't crude attempts at representation but sophisticated works that demonstrate mastery of stone carving techniques. The artists understood perspective, proportion, and composition. They could create the illusion of movement and depth on flat surfaces. The variety of animals depicted shows keen observation of nature. The artists knew how different animals moved, their characteristic postures, their anatomical details. A fox carved on one pillar shows its distinctive bushy tail and pointed ears. A boar bristles with aggression. A snake coils with sinuous grace. But beyond mere representation, the art shows symbolic thinking. Animals are sometimes shown in impossible combinations or positions that suggest narrative or metaphor rather than simple depiction. The famous vulture stone combines realistic animal depictions with abstract symbols in ways that suggest complex meaning. The T-shaped pillars themselves are artistic achievements. Their anthropomorphic form is abstracted just enough to suggest rather than define. They could represent humans, ancestors, gods, or all three simultaneously. This ambiguity might be intentional, allowing multiple interpretations and meanings. The progression of artistic styles through the different building phases shows both continuity and innovation. Certain motifs persist throughout: the emphasis on predatory animals, the use of certain geometric patterns, but each phase also shows unique elements, suggesting individual artists or schools with their own styles. Recent acoustic studies at Göbekli Tepe have revealed that the enclosures have unique sound properties. The circular arrangements of pillars create acoustic effects that amplify and modulate sound in specific ways. Speech or music performed in the center of an enclosure would have been heard clearly by everyone within the circle. This suggests that the site was designed not just for visual impact but for auditory experience. Rituals might have involved chanting, singing, or instrumental music that took advantage of these acoustic properties. The space might have been as much about sound as sight. Some researchers have suggested that the acoustic properties might have been used to induce altered states of consciousness. Certain frequencies and rhythms can trigger trance states, and the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe might have been designed to optimize these effects. The possibility of music at Göbekli Tepe opens another window into the minds of its builders. Music, like monumental architecture, serves no immediate survival purpose, yet humans have been making music for at least 40,000 years based on the oldest known musical instruments. The combination of architecture and acoustics at Göbekli Tepe might represent an early form of multimedia religious experience. Who exactly built Göbekli Tepe remains one of the site's enduring mysteries. We know they were hunter-gatherers, but beyond that, their identity is largely speculative. They left no human remains at the site, no clear depictions of themselves, no obvious cultural markers that would allow us to trace their descendants. Were they a single cultural group or a confederation of different tribes? The uniformity of the architecture suggests shared culture, but the variations in artistic style might indicate multiple groups contributing to the construction. Perhaps different clans or tribes were responsible for different enclosures, coming together for shared rituals but maintaining distinct identities. The absence of human burials at the site is particularly puzzling, given the obvious sacred nature of the space. We might expect to find elite burials or ritual interments. Their absence might mean that the dead were disposed of elsewhere, perhaps through sky burial, exposure to vultures, which would leave no archaeological trace, or perhaps the site was considered too sacred for burials, reserved only for the living to commune with the divine. The skills evident in the construction suggest the existence of specialists, master carvers, architects, perhaps even what we might call engineers. These weren't skills that could be developed casually. Someone spent years learning to carve stone with such precision, to plan structures with such accuracy. This implies a society that could support specialists, at least temporarily. Göbekli Tepe represents a sophisticated knowledge system that we're only beginning to understand. The builders had to understand geology, where to find suitable stone and how to work it; engineering, how to move and erect massive weights; architecture, how to create stable structures that would last; astronomy, how to align structures and track celestial movements; biology, detailed knowledge of animal anatomy and behavior; mathematics, proportions, measurements, geometric relationships; social organization, coordinating hundreds of workers; logistics, feeding and sheltering work crews; symbolism, creating and maintaining complex religious iconography. This knowledge had to be preserved and transmitted across generations without writing. It must have been encoded in stories, songs, rituals, and practices that we can only glimpse through the physical remains. The continuity of construction over 1,500 years suggests successful knowledge transmission across perhaps 60 generations. While Göbekli Tepe is famous for predating agriculture, it might actually represent the beginning of economic thinking. The site required planning, resource allocation, and delayed gratification on a scale previously unknown. Workers had to be fed while producing nothing immediately edible. Resources had to be gathered and stored. Labor had to be organized and motivated. This might represent the birth of what we might call surplus thinking, the idea that you could produce more than you immediately need and use that surplus for other purposes. While the builders didn't have agricultural surplus, they must have found ways to create temporary surpluses of wild resources, perhaps through large-scale hunting drives or intensive gathering. The feasting evidence suggests redistribution systems where resources were pooled and shared. This kind of economic cooperation would have been essential for the agricultural systems that would soon develop. In a sense, Göbekli Tepe might have been an economic experiment that paved the way for farming communities. The absence of clearly female imagery at Göbekli Tepe is one of its most striking features, especially when compared to other prehistoric sites, where female figurines, often called Venus figurines, are common. This absence raises important questions about gender roles in the society that built it. Several interpretations are possible. 1. The site was primarily a male space, used for male initiation rituals or gatherings. 2. Female imagery existed in perishable materials that haven't survived. 3. The abstract nature of the T-pillars encompasses both genders. 4. Women were involved but not represented in the iconography. 5. Gender roles were different from what we might expect. Some researchers have suggested that the transition to agriculture might have involved changes in gender relations, with Göbekli Tepe representing an older, possibly more male-dominated order that would give way to the more gender-balanced imagery of early farming communities. The animals carved at Göbekli Tepe present a paradox. They're predominantly dangerous creatures, predators, venomous snakes, scorpions, rather than the prey animals that hunter-gatherers depended on for food. This suggests the imagery wasn't about daily life, but about power, danger, and perhaps shamanic transformation. In many shamanic traditions, the most powerful spirit guides are predators. They represent strength, courage, and the ability to cross between worlds. The emphasis on dangerous animals at Göbekli Tepe might indicate that the site was where humans confronted their fears, sought power from dangerous spirits, or underwent transformative rituals. The precision of the animal depictions suggests not just observation but reverence. These weren't just animals but beings with spiritual significance. Each species might have had its own mythology, its own powers, its own relationship with human communities. One of the practical mysteries of Göbekli Tepe is water. The site has no natural water source, no springs or streams nearby. Any gathering of hundreds of people would have required significant water supplies, especially if they were engaged in hard physical labor. Several possibilities exist. 1. Water was carried to the site from distant sources. 2. Rainwater was collected and stored in vessels or cisterns not yet discovered. 3. The climate was different, with water sources that have since dried up. 4. Gatherings were timed to coincide with seasonal rains. 5. The site was used only for short periods that didn't require permanent water supplies. The water problem might have been another factor driving innovation. The need to supply water for large gatherings might have led to developments in water storage and transport that would later be crucial for settled agricultural life. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe, around 8000 BCE, marks the end of an era. By this time, agriculture was well established in the region. People were living in permanent villages, keeping domestic animals, growing crops. The world that had created Göbekli Tepe no longer existed. The burial wasn't violent or sudden. It was systematic, careful, almost loving. Each enclosure was filled with rubble, including broken pillars, stone tools, and animal bones. Some researchers see this as a deliberate decommissioning, like formally closing a church. Others see it as preservation for future rediscovery. The societies that buried Göbekli Tepe might have seen it as a relic of a bygone age, powerful but no longer relevant, or they might have seen it as too powerful, a threat to new ways of organizing society. Agricultural communities, with their emphasis on ownership, inheritance, and hierarchy, might have been incompatible with whatever Göbekli Tepe represented. The influence of Göbekli Tepe extended far beyond its immediate region. The ideas developed there, monumental architecture, large-scale social organization, possibly early agriculture, spread throughout the Fertile Crescent and beyond. Sites throughout the region show influence from Göbekli Tepe's architectural style. T-shaped pillars appear at multiple sites, though never with the same scale or sophistication. The idea of sacred spaces separate from living areas became a standard feature of later settlements. The social innovations developed at Göbekli Tepe, ways of organizing large groups, resolving conflicts, sharing resources, would have been crucial for the development of villages and eventually cities. The site might have been a kind of social laboratory where humans learned to live in larger groups. The religious concepts developed or expressed at Göbekli Tepe might have influenced later mythologies. The emphasis on sky burial, the importance of vultures, the sacred nature of certain animals, all these appear in later Middle Eastern religions. Some researchers see echoes of Göbekli Tepe in the mythologies of Sumer, Egypt, and even India. The rediscovery of Göbekli Tepe is a story worth telling in detail. For decades, the site was known to locals as a place to gather stones for building. The hill was obviously artificial, but everyone assumed it was Byzantine or Islamic, certainly not prehistoric. In 1963, a survey by Istanbul University noted prehistoric flints at the site, but dismissed it as unimportant. The summit was being used as a cemetery, and the surveyors assumed any prehistoric remains had been destroyed. For 30 years, the site was ignored by archaeologists. Klaus Schmidt's arrival in 1994 changed everything. An experienced archaeologist who had worked throughout the Middle East, Schmidt had an intuition that others lacked. He saw the potential others had missed. Within days of beginning excavation, he knew he had found something extraordinary. Schmidt dedicated the rest of his life to Göbekli Tepe, living on site for months at a time, carefully excavating and documenting every discovery. He was cautious about interpretation, often saying, "We know so little," even as evidence accumulated. His sudden death in 2014 was a tremendous loss to archaeology. The work continues under new leadership, with new technologies and perspectives. Each season brings surprises, new enclosures, new carvings, new questions. The site that was almost overlooked has become one of the most important archaeological discoveries of all time. Excavations at Göbekli Tepe are planned to continue for at least another 50 years, with only 5% of the site uncovered. Most of its secrets remain buried. Each season brings new discoveries that complicate rather than simplify our understanding. New technologies are being applied to the site. Ground-penetrating radar reveals structures without excavation. DNA analysis of soil samples identifies ancient plants and animals. Isotope analysis of human and animal remains reveals diet and migration patterns. Virtual reality reconstructions allow researchers to experience the site as it might have appeared to its builders. Other sites in the region are now being investigated with new eyes. The Tans-Tepler Stone Hills project has identified at least 11 other sites with T-shaped pillars. Some might be older than Göbekli Tepe, pushing the origins of monument building even further back. These discoveries are rewriting the textbooks. The neat progression from hunting to farming to civilization is being replaced by a more complex, more interesting story. Humans didn't simply progress from simple to complex. They experimented, innovated, sometimes failed, sometimes created wonders that wouldn't be matched for millennia. What does Göbekli Tepe mean for our understanding of ourselves? Several profound implications emerge. First, it shows that the human drive to create meaning through monuments and gathering places is incredibly ancient and fundamental. We are not just tool users or food producers, we are meaning makers. This drive might be what truly makes us human. Second, it demonstrates that complexity can emerge suddenly, without obvious precedent. The builders of Göbekli Tepe didn't gradually develop their abilities over millennia. They appeared suddenly, fully formed, creating monuments that wouldn't be equaled for thousands of years. Third, it suggests that our ancestors were far more sophisticated than we've given them credit for. They weren't primitive versions of us, but people with their own complex understanding of the world, their own solutions to problems, their own inspirations and aspirations. Fourth, it shows that religion or spiritual belief might be the driver rather than the product of civilization. The need to connect with something beyond ourselves, to gather in sacred spaces, to create lasting monuments to belief, these might be the forces that pushed humans towards settlement and agriculture. Why should Göbekli Tepe matter to someone living today, 11,600 years after its construction? Because it tells us something essential about who we are as a species. When you feel the urge to create something beautiful that serves no practical purpose, a poem, a painting, a garden, you're experiencing the same drive that led people to carve those pillars. When you gather with others for celebrations, rituals, or ceremonies, you're continuing a tradition that might have begun at Göbekli Tepe. The site reminds us that humans have always been more than practical creatures focused on survival. We've always reached for something more: meaning, beauty, connection, transcendence. These aren't modern luxuries but ancient needs that define our humanity. In our digital age, when virtual connection often replaces physical gathering, Göbekli Tepe reminds us of the power of coming together in real spaces for shared purposes. The builders understood something we sometimes forget, that there's power in gathering, in shared labor, in creating something larger than ourselves. Perhaps the greatest mystery of Göbekli Tepe is not how it was built or even why, but what it meant to the people who built it. We can analyze the stones, measure the pillars, catalog the carvings, but we can't truly enter the minds of the builders. Their thoughts, their beliefs, their motivations remain ultimately unknowable. This humbles us. Despite all our technology, all our analytical tools, all our accumulated knowledge, we stand before Göbekli Tepe, much as Klaus Schmidt did in 1994, amazed, puzzled, trying to understand something that exists at the very edge of comprehension. The builders left us a message in stone, but we don't fully understand the language. We're like children trying to read an ancient book, recognizing some symbols, guessing at meanings, but knowing that the full story remains beyond our grasp. And perhaps that's as it should be. Göbekli Tepe preserves mystery in an age that seems determined to explain everything. It reminds us that the past is a foreign country, not just in the trivial sense that people lived differently, but in the profound sense that they thought differently, believed differently, experienced the world in ways we can barely imagine. Göbekli Tepe hasn't finished revolutionizing our understanding of the past. As excavations continue, as new sites are discovered, as new analytical techniques are developed, our picture of this crucial period in human history continues to evolve. Recent discoveries at Karahan Tepe, just 35 miles from Göbekli Tepe, suggest an even more complex picture. This site, potentially contemporary with or even older than Göbekli Tepe, shows similar T-shaped pillars but also includes chambers carved from bedrock and what might be the world's oldest narrative sculpture, a man holding his phallus, carved in massive scale. These sites together suggest not a single monument but a sacred landscape, a region where multiple communities were experimenting with monumentality, developing religious and social innovations that would reshape humanity. We're not looking at an isolated phenomenon, but a cultural revolution that transformed how humans related to their environment, their communities, and their gods. Göbekli Tepe is also proving valuable as a climate archive. The sediments that buried the site contain information about ancient weather patterns, vegetation changes, and environmental conditions. This data is helping scientists understand the climate changes that coincided with the origins of agriculture. Pollen preserved in the sediments shows that the area was transitioning from steppe to woodland during the site's use. This environmental change would have affected the plants and animals available to the builders, possibly contributing to the pressure to develop new food procurement strategies. The animal bones found at the site are also informative. The species present and their relative abundances tell us about hunting practices, seasonal gatherings, and environmental conditions. Changes in these patterns over time might reflect both climate change and human impact on local ecosystems. Researchers are using experimental archaeology to better understand how Göbekli Tepe was built. By attempting to replicate the construction techniques using only tools and materials available to the builders, they're gaining insights into the practical challenges and solutions. These experiments have shown that quarrying a single pillar would take a team of 10 workers about 2 months. Moving a 10-ton pillar requires at least 50 people and sophisticated understanding of friction and leverage. Carving the reliefs with flint tools is possible, but requires exceptional skill and patience. The limestone is easier to work when freshly quarried, suggesting the carvings were made at the quarry. These experiments help us appreciate the enormous investment of time and effort the monument represents. They also reveal the sophisticated planning required, coordinating teams, timing operations, maintaining tools, feeding workers. While we can't know what language the builders of Göbekli Tepe spoke, linguists are finding clues about the linguistic landscape of the ancient Near East. The distribution of language families today, combined with archaeological evidence, suggests that the region was linguistically diverse even in prehistoric times. The symbols and patterns at Göbekli Tepe, might represent early attempts at information storage that would eventually lead to writing. The repeated geometric patterns, the standardized way of depicting certain animals, the consistent use of specific symbols, all suggest a system of visual communication that, while not true writing, was a step in that direction. The need to coordinate construction at Göbekli Tepe might have driven developments in language, specialized vocabulary for construction, counting systems for organizing labor, perhaps even early forms of contracts or agreements between different groups participating in the building. Göbekli Tepe shouldn't be understood in isolation, but as part of a sacred landscape that included natural features, other monuments, and patterns of movement across the terrain. The choice of location on a hill visible from great distances was clearly deliberate. The viewshed from Göbekli Tepe is remarkable. On clear days, you can see for dozens of miles in every direction. The site commands the landscape, visible to anyone traveling through the region. This visibility might have been crucial to its function as a gathering place. The relationship between Göbekli Tepe and water sources, animal migration routes, and plant gathering areas would have created a sacred geography that structured how people moved through and understood their world. Pilgrimages to the site might have followed specific routes, with stops at other sacred places along the way. While we can't know the specific myths and stories told at Göbekli Tepe, we can see echoes of ancient themes that appear in later mythologies throughout the region. The emphasis on dangerous animals, the vulture symbolism, the anthropomorphic pillars, all these elements appear in various forms in later religious traditions. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest literary works from ancient Mesopotamia, contains themes that might echo from Göbekli Tepe: the tension between wildness and civilization, the power of dangerous animals, the search for immortality. While written thousands of years later, it might preserve ancient memories. The concept of the axis mundi, the world pillar or world tree that connects earth and sky, appears in many mythologies and might be represented by the T-shaped pillars. These pillars might have been seen as cosmic connectors, linking the human world with divine realms. As we come to the end of our journey through Göbekli Tepe, we find ourselves not with answers, but with a deeper appreciation of the mystery. This hill in southeastern Turkey has shown us that the dawn of civilization was not a simple story of practical innovations leading to social complexity, but something far more interesting. A story of humans reaching for transcendence, creating meaning through monumental effort, gathering to touch something beyond the everyday world. 11,600 years ago, when the world was warming from the last ice age, when wild wheat grew on the hillsides and vast herds of gazelles migrated across the grasslands, groups of hunter-gatherers came to this hill. They came not to live but to build, not to shelter but to worship, not to survive but to create something that would outlast them by millennia. They quarried massive stones with tools of flint and obsidian. They carved images of animals with a precision that speaks of reverence and deep observation. They arranged these stones in circles that might map the cosmos or the geography of the spirit world. They gathered, feasted, performed rituals we can only imagine, and then carefully, deliberately buried their creation. Why? We may never fully know, but in their monumental ambition, in their desire to create something permanent in a world of change, in their gathering together for purposes beyond mere survival, we see ourselves. The builders of Göbekli Tepe are not strangers from an alien past, but our ancestors in the deepest sense, people who shared our need for meaning, our drive to create, our desire to gather with others in service of something greater than ourselves. As you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine them, those ancient builders on their hill in Turkey. See them arriving from scattered camps, greeting friends not seen since the last gathering, sharing news of births and deaths, good hunting grounds and changing weather. Watch them working together, perhaps competing between groups, to create the most elaborate pillar, the most precise carving. Hear their songs, their stories, their prayers to gods whose names we'll never know. They built something that would outlast their culture, their language, their entire world. They created a mystery that we're still trying to solve. a question that echoes across 11,600 years. What makes us human? What drives us to move mountains, literally and figuratively in service of belief? Göbekli Tepe suggests an answer. We are the species that builds temples before we build homes, that creates art before we create writing, that gathers for worship before we gather for trade. We are meaning makers, symbol creators, monument builders. This is what made us human, not agriculture, not cities, not technology, but the drive to create sacred spaces where earth reaches toward heaven. The pillars still stand, weathered but unbroken, carrying their cargo of carved animals and abstract symbols across the millennia. They stand as testimony to the power of human cooperation, the depth of human imagination, and the antiquity of human spirituality. They remind us that even at the dawn of settled life, humans were capable of greatness. Sweet dreams. And remember that beneath that hill in Turkey lies evidence of humanity's first great leap, not the leap to agriculture or to cities, but the leap to creating monumental meaning, to building something that connects us to forces beyond ourselves, to leaving markers that say, we were here, we wondered, we reached for something more. Tomorrow, the excavations will continue. New pillars will emerge from the earth. New carvings will be revealed. New questions will arise. The conversation between present and past will continue, mediated by stone and symbol, across a gap of time that spans nearly 12,000 years. And in that conversation, in our attempt to understand these ancient builders, we might just learn something essential about ourselves, about what drives us to create, to gather, to build, to seek meaning in a universe that often seems indifferent to our existence. Göbekli Tepe stands as proof that this search for meaning is not modern but ancient, not learned but fundamental, not optional, but essential to who we are as a species. It is the temple at the dawn of time, and its builders are still speaking to us, if only we can learn to listen.